Okay, so now for the main event, what you guys all came to see. Dr. Morgan Vis, Chair and Professor of Environmental and Plant Biology, and her topic, algae, friend or foe. Hey. No, Morgan?
Okay, well, it's great to be here tonight. I wanted to start out with a little bit about my poster here that you saw. Hopefully a lot of you got a chance to look at this. I wanted to give a shout out to my colleague, Ethan, who goes by the name of Black Mud Puppy. If you ever want to follow him on Twitter, he's a wonderful artist who took kind of my terrible line drawing and made it into something here. So for those of you who have heard of different types of algae, I'll just let you know that this is our foe. And our foe is Microcystis, and we'll be talking about Microcystis in just a minute. And then this is our valiant friend of an alga, and my lab has decided to name him or her, because it's unisex, Jackie the Batrachie, because I work on Batrachospermum. So just a shout out for that. So let's start out with a question here. So tell me about algae. Tell me, what have you heard about algae? Somebody. Biofuels.
First photosynthetic organism.
First photosynthetic organism. Yes.
They can make a lake into no longer a lake if there's too much of it.
They can make a lake into no longer a lake if there's so much of them. They can bloom. There. What else? Oh, t-shirts are flying already. Come on, one more algae fact. Yes. What? Pollution. Yes. So, sushi. Oh, I do this with my son all the time, and I go to the doctor and they say that I have good hearing, but obviously I don't. Okay, I have something else on my mind. I wanted to mention, so when I was putting this together, I went to the web, as we all tend to do, and I Googled, and I went to the New York Times, and they pulled up the latest things, all the news with algae. And as you can see, algae in Lake Erie, what can be done? Miles of algae covering Lake Erie. In the depths, dark sea corals create their own sunshine. Okay, that's like a thumbs up for algae. And then beware the bloom, toxic algae found in some city ponds. And so I feel like sometimes the algae really gets a bad rap. Especially in the media, we tend to focus on some of the negative things. And certainly there are negative things about algae. And I think many of you will recognize what this is. What's this satellite view of? Of the Great Lakes there, and in particular, our favorite Great Lake here in Ohio? Lake Erie. Yeah, I'm actually from over here in Grand Rapids, Michigan. But and what we see here from orbit then is you can see this bright greenish spot here, and actually Saginaw Bay, we have some green there. So wherever things are a bit shallow, we're seeing these large algal blooms, and they are a particular problem. Does anyone know what type of algae we see in these blooms in Lake Erie? What we've heard of? Microcystis. And Microcystis is a cyanobacterium. And Microcystis, the problem with this is not only is this a huge bloom, and when the algae bloom, what happens is you get a big bloom of algae. The algae then starts to decay and die, and microbes start to use it as food, and then they suck all of the oxygen out of the water, and we get these dead zones where the oxygen's depleted, and then we get fish kills from these. But not only that, we also get a lot of different toxins. And so this is a map from Ohio EPA showing where they monitor for various types of toxins from cyanobacteria. And you can see the level of those toxins then, and luckily blue is good. Let me start out there. Blue is good there. But we can see higher and higher concentrations of these toxins. So our different government agencies are actually monitoring for these different toxins from these different types of cyanobacteria so that we have obviously clean water to drink there. So that is a negative effect of it. I wanted to start out with the negatives. So algal blooms, harmful algal blooms are a negative, but there's so much more positive about algae. And one of the things is that we get a lot of different sorts of products from algae. Somebody mentioned biofuels over there. This is a farm. This is an algal farm here. And this is a small-scale farming of algae, but they farm algae in the marine environment. They can farm it in very, very large farms there. And there are two products that I wanted to mention from algae, and one is from this one. This is called chondrus, and we get this product that we find in a lot of different things. We get this product called carrageenan. And carrageenan's a really great gelling agent. And how many of you guys have tried algae? And what kind of algae have you tried? Nori, of course, the sushi wrappers. And, oh, look at me. I'm like a he person, right? I can't even open the packages. Oh my gosh, Rox is coming to save me. Oh, am I giving lots of feedback here? Okay, here, wait. We have helper one. Who else is going to be a helper? I'm sure there's a t-shirt might be in it for them. Come on. Okay. Help me by opening that. So who's willing to try? These are Seaweed Snacks. They're well seasoned. I know. I'm a little nervous up here talking to the public. So seaweed is algae that lives in the ocean. And I will show you a picture in a little bit of all the different things algae are. So algae is a really wide group of organisms. There. Yes?
The seaweed is dry, like a seaweed or dry algae, or they cook it?
So the question was, are seaweed a dry algae or are they cooked? You can have it many different ways in terms of the algae there. So the nori tends to be something that is not always cooked, but you can also make different sorts of seaweed soups and the like out of the different types of seaweed there. So hopefully everybody's getting a chance to try a little bit of this. Oh, I see some faces. I see some faces there. Come on, you gotta try your algae. So, how many people here who tried, oh, I see the tongue going, blah. So how many here were a fan of the seaweed snacks? They're kind of spicy. Tastes like what? Like mackerel? It tasted fishy. Okay, there. So, thank you all for trying for trying the seaweed snacks. As I mentioned, if you read the back of some of the different types of foods that you eat, you're going to probably find this thing called carrageenan. If you have a yogurt for lunch, you'll probably find carrageenan in that. And there's lots of other kinds of products. Now, does anyone know what product this might be? What that's the label for it. Oh my gosh, if you have 2 cookies, it's 150 calories. That's Girl Scout cookies. Do we know what kind of Girl Scout cookies? Samoas. Is that like our favorite type of Girl Scout cookie? Ah! I have kept 4 boxes of Samoas from those in my lab just for today so that I could share them with you, okay? So my helpers, come on out. Let's see if people want to try this other algae snack here. Helper? Oh, I'll just put that. Yeah, my lab's like, oh, we're getting a box of those. Right? So now we have coffee and we have our algae snack to try there. And as I say, so we have carrageenan. Another thing, and especially if you've ever taken a science class, another thing that comes from algae that you might not have thought about is agar. So how many of you have had to look at bacteria on agar plates? Maybe you got to do a class where you ran your DNA out on a gel, right? Gel. That gel is made out of agar. And so that agar comes from red algae, and it's a product of their cell wall. So both the carrageenan and agar, if you ever see those in your food, you know that those came from red algae. And I work on freshwater red algae, but these things come from marine red algae. And so they're really kind of lots of, shall we say, economically important and scientifically important products that we get from algae. Anything up here interest anybody? Can you? So there are lots of other types of products. I just thought I would bring a few things. You can come up afterwards and take a look. One of my students who went to the tropics found these seaweed Pringles. So they were flavored somewhat similarly to the first algae snack you guys had. They are now empty. We had to try them. What else do we have? All the rest of the stuff not look too interesting? What? Kombucha. Oh, the kombucha. So there are a lot of different sorts of drinks that are like Green Machine and the kombucha and stuff, and these all have algae in them too. Wait a second here, let's see. It has blue-green algae, spirulina, chlorella, and they are all organically produced, the algae there. But as my student who gave me this told me, and 100% pure love, but that does not appear to be organic. So if you have different sorts of health drinks, you will find very typically spirulina and chlorella in those types of drinks there too.
Is that tea?
Oh, so this is a tea that has algae in it, and it's supposed to be good for your digestive system, and just like mints are. Now, it does say, I have to admit, I had a student who left my lab, went to France, and she sent me all sorts of products from France that had algae in them. And so that's what this is. It's also supposed to flatten your stomach. So it's got all sorts of good stuff in it. There. What? Show the algae toys. If anyone has ever been to my office, they know I have toys. And I have algae toys. So this is a bad algal toy. This is red tide. So this is the marine version. These guys cause those red tides in the marine environment there. It's what we call a dinoflagellate. We have a cyanobacterium here. And this one is Anabina, and we see this, it lives symbiotically with a number of different types of organisms. It has a specialized cell here, and I have my class here today who just had an exam. They just had an exam. Okay, what is the big clear cell in our Anabina class? A heterocyst. And these guys fix atmospheric nitrogen. So just like, we eat our legumes, because our legumes have a symbiosis in which they get a lot of nitrogen, so we get a lot of good amino acids from them. Same sort of thing with these cyanobacteria. I'll just mention this really quick because I think it's pretty cool here. If you've ever been to the tropics, sometimes you hear about bioluminescence in the water. And this one is one, they call it sea sparkle, but it's Noctiluca, and it is a bioluminescent dinoflagellate. So this one is related to this one, but this one gives you bioluminescence, and this one gives you harmful tides. So that the good and the bad right here next to each other. And then this last one, his name is Scum, otherwise known as pond scum. This is a diatom, and diatoms and diatomaceous earth are used for a number of different products. So I saw some head shaking. Has anybody had an encounter with diatomaceous earth? Yes. Yeah, on farms it's used as an organic pesticide, and that's because these guys live in glass houses. So they have a glass shell, and that glass shell then is ground up into diatomaceous earth and used for a number of different products, including to make your teeth sparkle and different sorts of toothpaste there. So one last one, if you'll allow me, and this doesn't have an economic use, but I really, really like it. This is a red alga, and it's called a rhodolith, a red rock. And so this is a coral and red alga, and we've heard of corals, and we think about coral reefs, and you think about those wonderful coral animals and stuff, but these guys also live on those types of environments. And what happens is a little piece breaks off and it rolls around in the ocean. And as it rolls around, it's still growing. And it ends up to look like very round, like a big round rock there. These are so important in coral reef environments. They actually give the coral larvae a place to settle. And sometimes they need to have these coral and red algae just so that the larvae know where to settle and where to start growing. So these are very, very common in the marine environment. And I just wanted to bring this one along. So, and as I say, you are welcome to come up and take a look at things afterwards. Any questions? I got to remember to ask for questions. Okay. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about the great variety of algae. So I hope I've convinced you that there's a lot of different things that algae can do. This is the eukaryotic tree of life. And here we are, right here on this nice little branch. And then there's the whole rest of the tree. And if you look at what my colleagues study, the plants, and think about how much diversity there is that we see in all those flowering plants. And we think, oh my gosh, we have to take a class and we have to learn every single one of those flowers there. And so the land plants all are on this little branch right there. And then everything that is in bold here, the red algae, the green algae, the glaucophytes, the cryptomonads, the haptophytes, the euglenoids, the brown algae, which are our kelp beds, the diatoms, and the dinoflagellates, and the chloracneophytes. They look like green spiders and stuff. All of those are considered algae. So algae is kind of this word that we use for anything that is photosynthetic that is not a plant. So I get to teach, so my colleagues teach this, and I get to teach all the rest of this. So it's pretty cool. So rocks.
Morgan, why is one of your algae outside their box? It's not in one of the colored boxes. It's like it escaped.
The cryptomonads here. This is,
The other ones on the other side.
oh no, and the haptophytes. Yeah, they don't tend to be in these big families or these big groups of organisms. And so they're kind of off just on their own there. They're very important. The cryptomonads are really important in very high quality waters. And we see them a lot in fresh waters that are really, really high in quality. And the haptophytes produce a lot of the oxygen that we see in the ocean. So these are really, really important groups, but they are kind of off on their own. Thank you. Okay. So I've just told you about the whole of the algae. We're going to focus now on the red algae because I work on the red algae here. And so we're going to start to talk a little bit about my own research. Is Dr. Popescu here? How many of you were able to go to Dr. Popescu's talk on conservation? A few people. He talked about bobcats, right? Grrr, we're all bobcats. But he also talked about these hellbenders, and I was really, really interested in that. And they call them sometimes snot monsters, snot otters. See, I like things, my algae's slimy, so, you know, the idea of snot's pretty cool to me. Those of you who came to his talk, do you remember anything about what he was talking about when he talked about the habitat of these hellbenders? What kind of habitats would we find hellbenders in? Shaded streams. What about the water quality of those streams? Yes?
Has to be very high water quality.
High water quality. And so it's very difficult for hellbenders because they need these really high water qualities, right? And so we're seeing fewer and fewer of the hellbenders. My freshwater red algae also need high quality waters and indicate high quality waters. So I'm all for the hellbenders because they are preserving the habitats that I want to see for my organisms. And so I look at them as they are the charismatic megafauna that helps my freshwater red algae survive. So I just wanted to tell you that freshwater red algae and hellbenders, they have something in common there. So, what do we do out in these streams? These are my snot monsters. Okay, these are my freshwater red algae. What's the first thing you notice about them? They're not red. What a misnomer, right? And it turns out that red algae, they have 2 different colors of pigments that harvest light for photosynthesis. They have phycocyanin and phycoerythrin. Phycoerythrin is algae red, and phycocyanin is algae blue-green. The red algae in the marine environment, the seaweeds, the showy seaweeds, they tend to be dominated by the phycoerythrin, whereas my beloved freshwater red algae, because they live in a different kind of light environment, they are dominated by the phycocyanin. So they are always going to look kind of bluish green to brownish color there. And I wanted to give you a little bit of a size, because we've had a lot of rain lately. I couldn't go out and collect my algae to show you guys. So the size of these, if you look here, I have a couple of different individual plants in the bags there. So they're all about yay big. So if you can think about them that way, they're small but mighty, especially in where they live. They provide a lot of food, and they provide habitat for a lot of the macroinvertebrates that are in the streams here. And so I work a lot actually with a group, the Appalachian Watershed Research Group, which is comprised of a number of people who study different aspects of streams. So like Natalie Cruz, Jen Bowman, Kelly Johnson, and Dina Lopez. We all form a research group there and look at our various groups of organisms. Oh, and I wanted to mention, before I get too far into the weeds about my research, is that I've been very lucky. The National Science Foundation has funded much of this research that I will talk to you about today. So, without them, I never would have been able to do some of the basic research that I think will lead to really interesting and new discoveries there. So I also wanted to give a shout out to my main funders. So when we think about identifying things, and we look at, and I come from the plant biology department, so you'll have to excuse me. Plants are what I'm going to reference my algae against. So if we look at this, and what type of flower is that? Woo! That's right. We got a violet expert in the room here. My colleague, Harvey Ballard, and his lab members, Ann Sternberger, they study violets. And Dr. Ballard is always talking about how you can identify, like Ann was able to give us the genus and the species name of this. You can identify it based on the flower. So all the different parts of the flower give you characteristics that you can identify that flower with. Now with my algae, we also have lots of characteristics. We just have to look harder. We have to go deeper into the microscopic world to identify them. But this is the female reproductive structure for my algae, and we look at the shape and the size of that, whether or not it's on a long branch, if that branch has these other long branches around it. So we do have a lot of characters. And I say this because one colleague of mine used to call my algae morphologically challenged. It didn't have any characteristics, and it does have characteristics. It's just not, it's not a show-off like those flowers. It's more demure. So we use those to identify the algae. And so I'm a systematist, just like Dr. Ballard is a systematist, where he identifies different types of violets. I identify different types of algae. So not only do we identify them, but we also then take them back to the lab and we grind them up for DNA. And here's my favorite master's student. Sorry, Josh, if you're out there watching the live stream. Current master's student. So anyhow, so we also grind up part of our algae and we extract the DNA and we sequence different genes, and then based on those gene sequences we make these trees of the organisms so that we know how they're related evolutionarily. And so through this research, we have been able to better understand how different algae are related to each other, especially the freshwater red algae. And with this research then, we've been able, and I've been lucky enough, to actually describe genera and species that are new to science. And I kind of totaled it up the other day, and it looks to be around 30. So I didn't put them all on here. I just wanted to give you a smattering of the different sorts of algae that I've been able to identify. And I wanted to mention this too, and maybe I'll come over this way. How are you guys doing? Yeah. There are lots of different names. I am terrible at naming things. But that's where my lab and my colleagues really come up and get very creative with these names. And most of them I can actually pronounce. Because isn't it one of those things, those scientific names, they're kind of difficult. This first one I wanted to mention, this Batrachospermum, that means frog spawn. So the first person to look at this actually thought it looked like a bunch of frog eggs when they held it in their hands. And so they named it the frog spawn alga. And we've had a number of different sorts of ones since then. One of my favorite names, and I did kind of pick and choose here, Serendipitum. Batrachospermum serendipitum. And my colleague found it very serendipitous that he happened to stumble over this because he was running from a storm and he jumped into one part of the stream and there it was. So it was very serendipitous that he found that. I also have had people collect algae from all over the world. And so my colleague in Brazil, we found a species, Kumanoa amazonensis. Yeah, see, it is hard to say. From the Amazon. This one is actually from Indonesia and is named after the island in Indonesia. So we can name things after the places that they're from. We can come up with creative names like Serendipitum. I have to tell you a little bit, I hope my student is watching this on stream. So we named a new genus and a species named Lympha mucosa. And Lympha was after water nymph and very, very nice algal genus. But mucosa comes from the trials and tribulations of poor Josh Evans. This alga is a snot monster. And that snot kept him from getting good RNA to do his master's thesis with. And so I told him when we named this alga, we could name it mucosa after all of the things that this alga put him through. So sometimes, a lot of times, when you see these names of different animals and plants and algae, there's a story. There's a story behind it. And so if you look carefully, you'll find those stories in the papers that describe them. The last one of these I just wanted to mention was, and I hope I'm going to pronounce this right. And you guys are going to know if I pronounce it wrong, especially those from Ohio. So Thoria cocosinga Fushelii is, oh, no, I didn't. It's from the Kakasing River in northern Ohio. Did I say Kakasing right? Okay, good. Nobody knows. Yeah, it's Kakasing. Thoria Kakasing Fushelii. So a colleague of mine, he and his class were out doing a field trip, and they came across this Thoria, and he sent it to us, and darned if it wasn't a new species from right here in northern Ohio. So you can go to the Amazon, and I would highly recommend it. You can go very far afield. You can go to Indonesia and stuff, or you can just look for stuff right here in your own backyard. And a lot of times you will find something new if you just look a little more carefully. Wow, that sounded so profound. I also put this up here. One of the things we do as systematists is that when we do name a new genus or a new species, we have to tie that to something, because I'm not going to live forever. The next generation is going to come, and they're going to want to check out my science. And the way that they can check out our science is by knowing what particular alga what that name means. And so for each species, we have some herbarium sheet somewhere in a herbaria that actually represents that species. So that's how we do that. And this one, I just wanted to give a shout out. I have a student who's working on freshwater red algae from Africa. And we have been looking at this. I think it's beautiful. It's pretty color. We have been looking at this one, and this may turn out to be a new species. And if it is, this will be the piece of paper with the specimen on it that will endure. Whoop, did I hear? Oh, something different. Okay, so I invite you to come up, but Amanda wants to make sure that this keeps going, because as I say, it might be a new species there. You're still all with me, great. Okay. So I look at the evolutionary relationships, I name new species. What else can I do? Well, once we know more about these organisms, we can start to look for patterns. And one of the things that really drew me into science was biogeography. I was very curious on what is where and why and how and what is it related to. And so we have these two genera, Lemania and Paralemania, and they form a really interesting biogeographic pattern. And we were only able to see this after we started doing our systematic studies of them. So Lemania tends to grow in more northern latitudes, and Paralemania in more southern latitudes. I've been to a couple of streams in New York State where they both grow together. But here in Ohio, we seem to have the type of climate that we only get the paralamania, and I've never seen the lamania. So if I go to Canada, I'm always going to see lamania. If I go kind of Ohio and south, I always see the paralamania. So it has a really nice patterning to it. Now, what I tell my students, every time I tell you that there's a rule, darn it if there's not going to be a rule breaker. And it's okay to be a rule breaker, but then right here in India, we get a lamania. So it doesn't always hold true, but 99% of the time it holds true here. And lamania actually in India is eaten as a food, and it gives food a nice fishy taste, as people have said to it. So we had the mackerel there earlier. So freshwater red algae, of which I've never tried, gives it a fishy taste as well. I wanted to mention one other one, and hopefully at least you can see the different colors here. I color-coded this tree based on what continent the species was from. And I hope that what you can see there is we have a variety of different colors, and they seem to be randomly placed on that tree. There's not a lot of clumping of color there. And so this genus, I think, is really, really interesting because it seems to have this pattern that I cannot discern yet. I'm still working on it. The one thing I can tell you about this genus is it seems to be concentrated between these two lines. And it seems to have a lot of different species, and each species is in a very restricted area. But then when I look at the genus as a whole, it's actually a very worldwide in its distribution. So kind of stay tuned. I'm still trying to think my way through this particular one. Lastly, with the freshwater red algae, as we're learning more about their systematics and their biogeography, we are also taking into consideration the types of waters that they live in. And so we're measuring all sorts of parameters for the water. We're measuring the pH, the conductivity, the amount of nutrients in the waters. And so this is going to help us in our monitoring of water quality. I'm going to be perfect. The water frame directive that the European Union has, many of my colleagues there are using freshwater red algae as tools for biomonitoring. And the freshwater red algae show that there's a higher water quality, lower nutrients, lower sedimentation. So, you know, we see the Hocking River and we see how chocolate it looks. That would be really hard for mine to live in. So we're starting to kind of hone in on what types of water quality we get from our freshwater red algae. And if we find species A, we know the water's going to be this way, and if we find species B, we know the water's going to be that way. So we're still working on refining that, but this is helping us. Knowing what species is what really helps us that way. And I wanted to bring this back around then to what I talked about in the beginning. We talked about harmful algal blooms. Oh, we forgot about that, right? Algae only do good things for us. We talked about what? I brought it back around. Well, we talked about harmful algal blooms, but we talked about carrageenan from red algae, and we talked about agar from red algae, and I showed you some products here and the like there. When we go to try and find a better agar or alga that produces more agar, when we know the systematics, we can go and look at the nearest neighbor or the sister to maybe a species that we're already growing. So it gives us a jump ahead. It tells us where to target our efforts. We don't look at all red algae. If we want to get a better agar producer, we're going to find all the red algae that are evolutionarily related to this particular one. And the same sort of thing goes when we think about harmful algae. We're going to target those that are around the ones that we already know produce toxins to look at them. So I hope today I've convinced you that algae have a wide array of uses and have given you a little bit of a glimpse into my research and why systematics can be a foundational science that we can use for other types of science there. So with that, I'll take any questions. Abby. What do I think of algae as a bioenergy source? So I think it's a good bioenergy source. The thing that's going to make algae viable as an energy source is the high quality or high value products that we're going to be able to produce from that algae and then use the leftovers for the biofuels. So there are a number of different pigments that we get from algae that are very costly, and you can sell them for a lot of money. And I think if we can combine those, so if we can combine products that we can get a lot of money for and then still have leftover algae to make as a biofuel, then that will move forward. But just on its own, it's very hard to make a lot of money at algae as a biofuel, just because of the ups and downs. If you look at how much gas costs today and then how much gas costs on a different day, it's really too volatile of a market. But we'll get there. We'll get there.
I have a question. So from your tree, plant only one branch. But yeah, algae have lots of branch. But
Yes.
As far as the plant has more work. Now, first question, which one has more species?
Okay, so I showed you and Ziwa got my gist. So the question was, we have this big tree where my algae cover all sorts of different branches of the tree, and then we have, we alluded to that plants are only on one branch. How many different species of flowering plants are there? I need help with the flowering plant people.
About 400,000 species, more than 400,000 species.
Okay, so there are more than 400,000 species of plants. With my red algae, there are about 7,000 species of my red algae. There are about, they're big estimates. The diatoms, there's talk of them having 20 to 50,000 different species. So probably all together, we probably have as many species as there is on that single flowering plant branch. But he who has the most species doesn't always win. It's the breadth of the species. So I'm still going to claim victory.
Okay. So, but and as evolutionary, what we all learned from our textbooks, say the plants are more evolved because it survived the increased diversity. So how come the algae, is the bare bottom of our plants? What's the evolutionary advantage in terms of algae?
So what is the evolutionary advantage of algae? So it is true that there's one group of algae, the green algae or the streptophytes, that are the closest living relative to plants. But all the other algal groups are not very closely related to plants. They have had just as much time to evolve, and they have diversified. The diatoms are a very good example of diversification. But they have diversified in a variety of different habitats. We do have terrestrial algae as well, and those have been very little explored. So one of the things that we run into is we have a lot of what we would call cryptic species because people haven't looked at them as carefully throughout time.
So this is a very interesting topic.
Woo. Yes?
I was wondering if you've looked at like fossilized algae, like deposits of conservation, to look at like paleo environment or paleo biogeography.
So the question was, have I looked at algae for fossilized algae in the paleo environment? My particular group doesn't have any hard parts that that preserve very well, but diatoms are a great one to look at paleoclimates, and we were just talking about that in class the other day. And so a lot of like oil cores, they will use those cores and they will slice those up and actually be able to look at the climate hundreds and thousands of years ago based on the diatoms. So the diatoms are a great group for paleo work. There are a few other ones, these rhodoliths, they fossilize very nicely, and you get those to look at as well. So it's a really cool area of study. I would highly recommend it.
So I've seen like popular companies such as Lush use like seaweed and other forms of algae for like glitter and other typically products made of plastic. What are you thinking about algae replacing plastic as like a...
So the question is, what do I think about algae replacing plastic? And there are a number of companies starting to do that sort of thing. And I think algae is a great replacement for plastics. Bioplastics are really important in terms of sustainability. And so they are, my students each class period, they have to come up with an algae fun fact, and they know that I might call on them. And our last two algae fun facts in class were bio yarn, so yarn made from algae, and then the other one were these shoes made from bioplastic from algae, so algae shoes. So that's coming. It's a really great market.
So we have marine algae, freshwater algae, and now I just know we have land algae. I'm just curious, which group is more vulnerable for the climate change? Which one is more dangerous to the climate change?
Oh, so the question is, we have marine algae, freshwater algae, algae that live in the terrestrial environment. Which ones are more susceptible to climate change, or yeah, so unfortunately all of those environments are experiencing changes, and so they are all pretty well equally in peril there. That is the short answer to it.
So it's kind of like the algae doesn't have any adjustment or evolution.
So they're looking at especially in the marine environment more than I would say the freshwater environment. They're looking at the physiology of the algae. So just like we look at the physiology of plants and decide whether or not they are going to like move to more northern climates or move up the mountain or down the mountain, that's the same sort of thing with algae on the seashore or the kelps, well, especially the kelps, but the seaweeds on the seashore. They've already seen some changes in their ranges and distributions because of warming seas.
With respect to luminosity, why is it that a red tide can hang around on beaches and close them for weeks, and the green can come and go in a matter of a couple of hours?
So the question was, how come red tides can stick around for weeks and then the bioluminescence we only see for a short period of time? A lot of it depends on the weather. So when we have a red tide, it depends on what the weather conditions are, whether or not there's sufficient flushing of like a bay so that those cells get flushed out of the bay and more dispersed because of the blooms there. And the same sort of thing would happen with the bioluminescent ones as well. So it really can vary quite significantly on how long you're going to have that. With the algal bloom in Toledo, and that shut down the water treatment plant, it was just that the weather conditions were just right to push it right exactly where we didn't want it to be. And then it stayed nice and warm and was calm, and so nothing got away.
What's the evolutionary advantage to bioluminescence and algae?
So the question is, what's the evolutionary advantage of bioluminescence in algae? I don't know that it's an evolutionary advantage, but it's thought that the bioluminescence, what it does is it stuns predators. So this flash at night kind of flashes and stuns them so that they don't get, not everybody in the herd gets eaten by that. So, well, that's the last one, but I'll hang around if anybody has any other questions. And I thank you so much for your listening the past hour.